the University of Pennsylvania Law School, my alma mater, announced it was initiating a sanction process against Professor Amy Wax over controversial things that she's written and said about race.
Do you ever regret having chosen to refuse to play by the rules that most academics accept?
Lefty causes, such as pro-Palestinian positions, are protected, they are favored, there's resounding defense of them. Truck drivers and store clerks are paying taxes so Harvard can peddle anti-Western, anti-American ideas.
This episode of Think Twice is sponsored by the Jewish Future Promise, ensuring a vibrant and thriving future for Jews and Israel. This week we have a fascinating conversation for you with controversial University of Pennsylvania law professor Amy Wax, who has been at the cutting edge of the debate about free speech in academia. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, you still don't have to wait a full week for more of our content. There is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And one programming note, we'll be off next week, but we'll be back with another program at the beginning of July. Just how much do you believe in free speech? Most Americans claim to favor it, though most believe in the version that means free speech for them and not for those with whom they disagree. And as we've seen in recent years, free speech in the academy generally means freedom to express left-wing opinions, to impose and indoctrinate students in the woke catechism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and the toxic myths of critical race theory, intersectionality, and settler colonialism, and to suppress, silence, isolate, and shun anyone who disagrees. Which means there is plenty of freedom for those who have mainstreamed and legitimized anti-Semitism and advocacy for Jewish genocide and the destruction of the State of Israel, but precious little for those who seek to push back against it. Indeed, the efforts of President Donald Trump to roll back the woke tide in academia by defunding schools that allow and encourage anti-Semitism is treated by enlightened liberal opinion, including on the part of those who claim to be concerned about the post-October 7th surge in anti-Semitism, as authoritarian and a violation of free speech and academic freedom. Yet the same people have been largely silent about efforts to suppress conservative opinion, even when it is controversial or involves a willingness to denounce liberal orthodoxy about affirmative action, race-based policies, and ideas about immigration that run afoul of liberal sensibilities. One person whose fate embodies this struggle is Amy Wax, who has been suspended from teaching at the University of Pennsylvania for saying things that liberal colleagues, students, and administrators don't want to hear and think shouldn't be said. Wax is someone whose opinions are definitely controversial, but she is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to free speech and academic freedom, and gives the lie to the claim that elite universities welcome all views as part of their defense against Trump's efforts. And we're fortunate to have Professor Wax with us today to talk about her case and much else. Amy Wax is a tenured professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a medical doctor who is a trained neurologist. Professor Wax studied both law and medicine at Harvard University. She served in the office of the Solicitor General of the United States, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. She is an expert in social welfare law and policy, as well as the relationship of the family, the workplace, and labor markets. And she's the author of the 2009 book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, Group Justice in the 21st Century, and many articles in numerous publications. Amy Wax, welcome back to Think Twice.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, Professor Wax, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you what got you into this controversy at Penn. It started with a rather obvious defense of mainstream bourgeois culture in an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer that you co-authored, but was considered by so-called enlightened opinion as outdated or racist, and then got even deeper with more so-called controversial comments about affirmative action, minority achievement, and then even more so when you spoke about the differences between cultures, whether Europeans or Asians or those from elsewhere in the course of the last several years. And you've become a symbol of the repression of free speech in academia. It's the sort of thing that can be devastating for people who are built to withstand this kind of criticism. But you seem to have withstood it fairly well. How has it impacted your life? And do you ever regret having chosen to refuse to play by the rules that most academics accept?
Well, I'll start at the end of your comments. I don't regret it at all. I mean, obviously, it has enmeshed me in some controversy, a lawsuit that is very time-consuming and attention-consuming, surprisingly so. But there are two reasons I don't regret it. First of all, I really do believe in what I am doing. I think academia has gone astray, terribly astray. It has been captured by a far-left ideology. That ideology is adamant and determined to shut down the true spectrum of opinion, I guess you would call it, that exists in our country, in our society, and to punish it and suppress it. And just to put it succinctly, that is not an education. And that leads me to the second reason I don't regret it, which is the students. There is a significant contingent of students, even at Penn and countrywide. I just had coffee with a student that reached out to me from another university who are very dissatisfied with the education they're getting, the one-sided, tilted education they're getting in these elite institutions, the taboo, the narrow Overton window, which does not allow certain ideas to be expressed or even discussed. And they look to me to broaden their outlook, to talk about the issues that matter to them. Not all of them are conservative, but many of them are. And I really feel it's essential for me to be on the inside, as long as I can be, to serve those students and to help them get the kind of exposure and education that they are paying for.
Mm-hmm.
And many of them tell me, that I'm the only person out there that they can talk to about some of their ideas and concerns about Trump in, a non-deranged, hysterical way, because Trump derangement syndrome has the Ivies in its grip, as you can imagine. So that is very important to me at this point. And that is a very prominent reason why I am sticking with this.
Mm. At the core of your legal case against the University of Pennsylvania, which has suspended you from teaching for a year, I believe, after a long...
Although let me clarify that
go ahead.
suspension is supposed to go into effect July 1st.
Okay.
And the judge is just now considering my motion for an injunction to delay that suspension. So in the next couple of weeks, I hope we'll have a decision on that. But they have cut my pay. So that is something that is happening.
Right. And you've been in limbo for years since this process began. And I would say at the core of your case is the double standards by which conservatives are judged and punished by academic institutions in this age of wokeism. Yet the university and many of your colleagues seem to be acting as if there's nothing wrong with treating you differently than left-wing academics who often say things that other people don't like.
Well, that's right. They do. And I think that they are inconsistent, they are incoherent, they are blinded by ideology, and they are wrong. Yeah. For instance, the hearing board, the faculty senate hearing board that quote unquote heard my case. It was really a kangaroo court, and that was another problem with it. They cited me for, quote, inequitably targeted disrespect, unquote, a completely made up phrase. That was my infraction. Well, how are many of the pro-Hamas, anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish statements that have been made on our campus and on many other campuses, cartoons that depict Jews drinking Palestinian blood, all these anti-Semitic tropes. How is that not inequitably targeted disrespect? I mean, by what standard? This is a completely opaque rule. We don't understand what it means. And frankly, I think by any reasonable measure, there is a double standard being applied here. Lefty causes, such as pro-Palestinian positions, are protected, they are favored. There's resounding defense of them under the guise of academic freedom. And yet for me, when I make garden variety conservative observations about group differences or criticisms of some of the behaviors of minority communities, that is considered beyond the pale. That is unprofessional. That is not allowed. So I think it's very hard to explain that. And that is what we submit in our court papers, among other things.
Yeah, I think the contrast between the way Penn came down on you, and of course, there are other examples of conservatives who've been punished for their speech at other schools.
Yes.
And the way those, especially since the October 7th attacks, have not merely openly support the destruction of Israel and engage in anti-Semitic discourse, but have also directly advocated for violence against Israelis and Jews. There has been some strong pushback against that, as we saw with the fate of Penn's president, who, along with the leaders of Harvard and MIT, couldn't say that advocacy for genocide of Jews was against the rules at her school. But is the woke acceptance of smears of Israel so great that most of academia still thinks it's okay to chant for Jewish genocide and terrorism, but not to say the things that you've said about affirmative action and about the differences between the cultures of Europe and Asia and other places?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of, rhetoric and a lot of persiflage about being anti-Semitic and all of that. I mean, there's a lot of window dressing and posing about it. But I can tell you that in my own institution, no pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian spokesperson has been indicted, punished, charged in any way like I have. And, if you go out there in the rest of the country and you look at who gets cited, who gets punished, in all fairness, people on both sides of the aisle are being shut down in universities, but overwhelmingly it's conservatives. Why is that? Well, partly it's just practical because the left controls the universities. The left has an iron lock on academia. So if you consult the FIRE website, that's Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, you will see a shocking number of incidents. I myself was not aware of how many people are being punished or brought up on charges for, infractions that the left claims are unprofessional or unacceptable, the powers that be in the universities. And this is part of the problem. Part of the problem, a big part of the problem, is that the universities are captives of the far left, not just the left, but the far left. They have become completely unbalanced, and taxpayers are paying for this. What I like to say is truck drivers and store clerks are paying taxes so Harvard can peddle anti-Western, anti-American ideas to its students, and any praise for Western Civ and its outsized achievements is labeled white supremacy.
Right.
And that is what is going on in these universities. And that's a problem.
Yeah, I want to get to the broader problem of what's going on in universities and how to fix it, or if it can be fixed, a little later. But first, I want to sort of drill down on why they're attacking you. The consensus of liberal opinion, even among those who think Penn was wrong to discipline you, is that you've said things that shouldn't be said or are racist. But do you think your critics have given us a reasonable definition of what is racism when speaking about how groups perform, how people perform at universities?
No, they have not. Racist and all of these ist labels that get thrown about, they are these promiscuous terms that are slapped on people willy-nilly in the most amazingly sloppy way. I hate the word amazing, but it is disconcertingly sloppy way without precise definitions. They're weaponized. And if you ask 6 people what a racist is, you'll get 6 different answers. So it's very imprecise. It's very partisan. I think, the problem is that I do bring up facts and I do notice and talk about patterns that you're right. There's this implicit taboo on in the universities. You are not supposed to say certain things about sacred minority groups that are negative or unflattering. But these are real phenomena. These are actual behaviors and patterns in our society that our students need to know about, that we need to think about, that we need to understand. And we can't do that if there's this narrow orthodoxy about what can and cannot be said. And that is really what is going on. By the way, once you get outside the university, in some of the think tanks, and certainly on the internet, there are very intelligent, savvy, quantitatively sophisticated people who are actively talking about these issues. There are a number of websites, a number of Twitter accounts where these matters are brooded about in a very thoughtful and objective way, where the evidence is adduced. And frankly, I have students who, that's where they get their education. They follow these Substacks, they follow these websites. They're aware of the people working in these think tanks. And these are on topics like race, immigration, gender, even economic topics like welfare, how we should structure our redistributive system, taxes that really try to be realistic about incentives, disincentives, and people's behavior, and group differences, because group differences exist. And that is an important part of our national landscape.
Yeah. The start of the controversy that engulfed you preceded the 2020 Black Lives Matter summer and the moral panic about race that spread across the nation after the death of George Floyd. But that moment in American history seemed to signal the culmination of the left's long march through our institutions. For now, President Trump is engaged in a battle to roll it back via pulling funding from schools that the administration deems to have encouraged anti-Semitism on campus, as well as to try to loosen the grip of the woke catechism of DEI on hiring and admissions. Harvard is his particular target right now, but it also involves Columbia, and other schools are probably in the dock too. How do you feel about that and the claims that he is violating academic freedom, especially since it might be said that your fate at Penn highlights the problem that he seems to be attacking?
Yeah. Well, by and large, I am all for what he is trying to do. I commend him. I think academia, as I said, has gone off the rails. It's grown arrogant, it's grown partisan. It's doing it all with taxpayer money. It's gotten too powerful as a kind of gatekeeping and credentialing sector. And that to me is a real negative, and you can see it in the way people view elite academia. It's really a very negative view at this point, and I think that's justified. Now, of the particular things that he has done, and it's a very complex sort of set of efforts across the board. He is a man in a hurry, and some of his efforts are, I think, dubious, or they are going to encounter legal obstacles, in part because the left has structured the law and created so many obstacles to reform. Some of them, I think, are on much firmer ground than the mainstream media is willing to admit. And all of it is...
Which do you think are the ones that are most problematic? Which are the ones you think are the ones that are likely to succeed?
Well, on the likely to succeed or on firm ground, I can think of two right off the top of my head. One is withdrawing the tax exemption. There is very strong precedent to do that. These universities have violated the civil rights laws, have discriminated on the basis of race every day in multiple ways. They have multiple programs. They lie about it. They pretend they're not. They think they can get away with it. And under the Bob Jones case, which is still good law, the IRS can withdraw the tax exemption from institutions that violate public policy, and anti-discrimination is a very vital public policy. So I think there's a very strong argument there.
And DEI basically is racism when it's applied. At least that's
right,
in the practice.
When it's applied. Correct. When it's actually applied day to day to put the thumb on the scale for minorities, to show favoritism to minorities, to have special programs for minorities, all of that sort of thing's been going on forever. The second is there was a big fuss not long ago about cutting the overhead allotment for scientific grants. In some of these institutions, the overhead allotment for grants is 60%, 70% of the grant amount on top of the amount that's given for the grants. That's the product of a complex negotiation between the government and the schools. And, they're in bed together. I mean, they're very cozy. So, of course, this amount has grown. But when the schools were challenged and Trump tried to cut it back to 15%, they went crazy. But now we have radio silence because the schools refuse to actually account for how they are spending this money. I mean, they say we're spending it on equipment to keep the lights on. Well, I fear that they're spending it for DEI type programs and all sorts of bells and whistles, which if they actually laid it out, it would really look rather lavish and dubious. So the lack of accountability of the schools for how they are spending vast amounts of taxpayer money, I think is a fertile potential area where the government could put their feet to the fire and say, we have to see where this money is going. Finally, I would stress that when there are complaints about academic freedom, and some of them I think, do have some substance to them, we can't forget that these schools have made a pact with the devil by taking billions of dollars of taxpayer money. And it is actually unclear in the law how much leverage the government can have over what happens in these schools, what gets taught, how many administrators there are, how much power do they get by giving these grants. It turns out this is kind of an open question in the law. It's something called unconstitutional conditions. It's a difficult area. So there is some ambiguity there. Now, let me just say the stuff I think that, is probably they're not going to get away with doing is directly prescribing what can and cannot be taught in the classroom. There is a distinct tilt in the faculty, their beliefs, their instructions, the kind of courses that are taught, what is said there, but it's very hard to get at that directly. The real problem is that the faculty is self-reproducing. The institutions control the composition of the institution. That's what's called being self-governing. And to try and get more conservative scholars in the pipeline and hired and on faculty, that turns out to be very difficult for a lot of reasons. That, I think, is the way to produce more balance, introduce more balance in the universities, not telling them what they can teach and what they can't teach, because that really does, I think, interfere with traditional notions of academic freedom. And it will be turned against conservatives. I mean, when the Democrats and the lefties get back into power, they'll say, well, you told us what could be said and taught. Now we're going to turn around and tell you what can be said and
haven't
taught.
they been doing that for decades?
Well, right. They've done it from the beginning. They've denied it. That's what they've done to me. All right. But I don't want to give them more ballast for doing to me what they did.
Well, I guess what that, I think that's a pretty good summary of, the situation. If indeed Trump is, on shaky ground when saying you need to not be having Middle East studies departments that are basically, anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, anti-Western, or trying to get rid of DEI wherever it lurks, if that can, violate academic freedom. But I think we go back when you say, if you pull their tax exemption, as with Bob Jones, which goes back to the 1970s and 80s, I believe, when a small Christian university basically was discriminating against blacks. And the government just said, well, you're not going to get funding if you're violating the civil rights laws. I think schools that do, schools may be free to practice DEI or to teach whatever toxic leftist theories they want, but they don't necessarily have the right to do so with federal money or to have a federal tax exemption.
Well, I would distinguish between practicing DEI, which is special programs, special privileges, special, race-based hiring, from preaching DEI, because, people who are going to peddle this ideology, it's very hard to control that. I will add one more thing, though. I think we really want to maintain a robust free speech culture, but in order to do that, where the action should be is on the immigration and student visa front. I am for vastly reducing the number of foreign student visas to the point of getting rid of all of that. I think there's so much exaggerated rhetoric, which is fueled by the cult of diversity and multiculturalism about how we need all of these diverse people for a proper education. Well, as Charles Murray said, back when he graduated from Harvard, he estimated that 96% of his class was American citizens. And I think that if the taxpayers are paying billions into these institutions, they should be America First institutions that educate American citizens, aren't rejecting the sons and daughters of, ordinary people in favor of Saudi princes and Ghanaian plantation owners' children and all of that sort of thing. That's perverse. That's a grift, actually. But my overall take on what Trump is doing is, I think I would advocate starve the beast. Let's try to take away their money. They should be independent. If they want to be independent in how they operate, they should be independent financially. They can't have it both ways. And the university sector should shrink, needs to shrink. There are other options that ought to be funded. I think when Trump said, I'm going to take Harvard's money and give it to trade schools, I thought, wow, what a great idea. That would serve his core constituency, working class guys, help them get a start in life. I've been advocating for that forever. And there's just much less money available for those options, frankly. They all have to be accredited. There are multiple hurdles, to training as an airplane mechanic or an HVAC specialist or whatever. And it's expensive. So I would look in that direction. I think we need to kneecap some of these schools. And, it's not every method works. It's very haphazard at times, but I'm in agreement with the overall project.
Well, when it comes to the foreign students, I have to say, I mean, you noted what, about the graduating class at Harvard, some decades ago. I've been reporting about this issue in the last couple of years, and I was shocked at the percentages of students at Harvard and Columbia, NYU, or Penn that are foreign students, it is a grift. I mean, because these students are largely paying the full freight, far
They're
more
not paying
likely
the
than
entire
American students.
They're not paying the entire cost of their education.
Mhm.
See, these schools are very sneaky. They want to have it both ways. They are paying full tuition, all right? But on the other hand, these schools tell us that tuition doesn't cover anywhere near the total cost of running these universities. That's why they need this slush fund from the federal government. That's why they need federal grants. So yes, foreign students are being subsidized by American taxpayers. Full stop. All right. And, you'll never read that in the New York Times, but that is the situation.
Right. I guess, the broader question that is being debated now about, Trump versus Harvard, Trump versus the universities, really the whole, the whole effort to try and do something about the way, the so-called progressives have taken over academia is, what is the right approach here? Do we try to burn them down, and start over? Is there, other than a few places like, Claremont or, the new University of Austin in Texas, there aren't very many obvious conservative alternatives. Can they be fixed? I guess that's the broader question we have to ask here, because a lot of them, even if they wind up not having the federal money, they've got big endowments. Obviously, it would take a big bite out of them if they lose their federal money. But can they be reformed? That's the broader question I think people ask me.
Well, I don't have a definitive answer to that. First I will admit that these universities do, some important research. It's not all downside. There is some upside. They're always emphasizing how they're curing cancer and all of that. I think it does need to be pointed out that one of the worst, most DEI intensive parts of the university is the medical school. All right. So science and medicine are not immune from this ideology, and I could tell you tales about that. So let's just get that clear.
That's something Heather McDonald has reported and written
Yes.
about as well. Yeah.
Of course. And you'll never once again read it in the New York Times. When they get up there and say how wonderful they are, they'll never talk about the ways in which medicine or science has become corrupted by these lefty priorities, and they think they're pulling the wool over our eyes. But back to the question, can reform come from within, or do they need to be just blown up? I was just at a conference in Canada where that was a hot topic of debate. And there was, a camp that said reform is not possible. They need to be blown up. And the only way we can really do it as a polity is to starve them of taxpayer money. Of course, the private donors can also act. And I've tried very hard to convince private donors not to give these colleges any more money. But of course, they want to get their kids in. They have selfish motives. So it's hard to persuade them.
There have been a few, especially a few prominent Jewish donors who have,
Yes.
done so since October 7th. But by and large, the universities are still raking it in, aren't they?
They are. And, there are some Jewish donors who have rebelled. I'm disappointed it took October 7th to get them to rebel because they're very blind to what else is going on. And of course, that's a broader problem that Jews just persist in being Democrats, even though, it's kind of a form of masochism, suicidal masochism. But that's a whole nother topic. But the problem is that these schools really have no clue. If you listen to some of the webinars, for example, that were produced in my own university after Trump was elected, the future of higher ed under Trump, there is not even the smallest glimmer of recognition of what people might be complaining about, what the problems are of the university that, have elicited dissatisfaction and this effort to change. They think they are wonderful. They deserve every penny they get. They are a glorious boon to mankind. All they need to do is just continue doing what they're doing. And the only problem is that people don't appreciate them enough. So I don't see any progress being made at all. I mean, they are circling the wagons. They are impervious to reform and improvement, and they all have Trump derangement syndrome to the max. Okay. Now, if that's true, what do we do about it? I think we just keep trying to kneecap them, starve them, use the federal leverage that we have to try to effectuate reform and keep winning elections. Harvard is a very powerful institution. It's going to be very hard to bring it down. But we can chasten it. We can shrink it. We can reduce it. That is possible.
At the heart of the Jewish people is a promise that ensures our traditions, values, and future endure for generations. The Jewish Future Promise is a movement I endorse. It is a moral commitment to securing that future. By signing the promise, we commit to keeping Jewish life vibrant and thriving for the next generation. Join me in shaping the future. Make your promise today. Sign the promise, jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise. I want to turn to a subject about which you've been vocal, that of immigration. You've said the United States needs to change its policies to favor some groups over others, and now President Trump has issued a travel ban that would prohibit the entry of most people from nations that he sees as problematic, something that is described in the liberal media as racist. What do you think about Trump's order and the way this issue is being discussed, which is, right now we're in the middle. As we speak, there are these riots in Los Angeles about, people protesting the federal authorities enforcing existing immigration laws. But let's talk about the travel ban for a minute. Is this something that's a distraction, or is it something fundamental? Are we getting anywhere with this?
Yeah, well, I haven't examined the travel ban in detail and looked at the list of countries. My understanding is it's a lot of Muslim countries, and the State Department is very concerned about some of the people that are coming in from these places. I'm not necessarily against it, but I think it is a little bit of a sideshow because the immigration problem, the broader immigration problem, really can be divided into two parts, right? The first is the whole problem of illegal immigrants and the grift of illegals pouring in, the Biden administration turning a blind eye, all of these rules that allow people to stay, the gross abuse of the asylum process,
right,
of the refugee programs, which were World War II programs that have outlived their usefulness. They are no longer relevant to the modern world. I mean, the categories that allow you to apply for asylum now apply to like 90% of the world. Well, 90% of the world is a place where people's political enemies are decimated and punished. Are we going to rescue the world from its own folly? No, I don't think we can do that.
Basically, everyone in Central and South America would be eligible.
And Africa and
Africa.
A lot of the
and the Middle East and much
Middle
of
East
Asia,
and the Russian areas, the Eastern Europe even. I mean, it's the whole damn world. The only part of the world that's really democratic and governed by rule of law and peaceful and prosperous is Europe and the Anglosphere. And the Anglosphere is going down the tubes pretty rapidly, actually. So, this is just an untenable set of categories that have to be radically rethought. And that's, so we've got the illegals, we've got, all these legal, quote unquote, categories. And then we've got the underlying immigration regime of, who gets to come in here and stay here and become an American citizen. And all three parts of it need radical revision. Now, if I were Trump and had been coming into office, the first thing I would have done, right, is say, we're scrapping the Hart-Celler Act and all its variations and accretions over the years. That's the 1964 Immigration Act, which is the main piece of legislation in effect right now. We just said, we're going to repeal it and we're going to replace it. And I would have had a plan in place much simpler and more transparent than we have now, so that ordinary people could know what the hell is going on. Okay, sort of immigration for dummies, right? And I would have used my legislative power like LBJ to twist some arms and say, you will pass this, all right? I mean, the problem with Trump is he's great at getting elected. I'm just not so sure how great he is at that hard work of governing and getting legislation passed. But there is no question in my mind that our entire system is broken, right? So, take deportation of illegals. I mean, that should be easy. I'm not saying there should be zero due process, but very minimal. And once again, the mainstream media distorts the truth. We need all these hoops that we have to jump through, but actually doesn't comport with the law. It can be, let's show me the piece of paper that shows you're legal. If you can't, out you go.
Right.
And of course, the public is its own worst enemy. We have Trump voters saying, oh, well, when I voted for Trump and when I voted that illegals should go home, I didn't mean that sweet little lady next door. Well, of course you did. I mean, what about illegal? Don't you understand? Do we say the same thing when, the sweet little lady's son goes to jail for assault or, being in a gang or whatever? I mean, one of the problems with our country is that a lot of people do. We've ceased to be a law and order country. And of course, the left is very selective about the rule of law. They will hold the MAGA people's feet to the fire on every jot and tittle. And this New York Times is from start to finish, they're illegal, they're illegitimate, they're autocratic, they're fascist, but they break the law all the time. And they advocate breaking the law. So
as we're seeing on the streets of Los Angeles.
Of course. And that behavior is just, it's outrageous. It would be comic if it weren't so outrageous how brazen people are about, waving Mexican flags when they're sitting in the United States of America. So we have a very confused citizenry about immigration. And of course, you're not allowed to recognize that there are differences, cultural differences, group differences, attitudinal and values differences that they don't apply to every person, because any group that you would identify, you're going to be able to find people who, are able to give up some of the aspects of their native culture and assimilate and throw their lot in with the American way. Those people do exist, but they will never exist in part of a mass migration movement. So a lot of what we refuse to realize is that the numbers have to be kept down. I have argued for this. The viability of maintaining our Western European post-Enlightenment culture, which is not universal, right? It is not universal, requires that the number of immigrants be low and slow. And that is the only way, I think, that we can maintain our integrity as a nation, honoring property rights, individual rights, constitutional constraints, rule of law, capital markets. I mean, all of these things that are essential to our success are endangered by bringing in people who are unfamiliar with them. Their culture doesn't practice them. They don't really understand them. They pay lip service, but they have no idea how to really live it from day to day.
Yeah, well, I think the sort of the counter argument from sort of mass immigration, even open borders people, is that in the past we did have large-scale immigration to this country in the late 19th and early 20th century from places that, whether it was Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, that were not very democratic and where people were not used to democracy and to Western culture as we understand it. But I think the difference then was that people were coming to embrace Western civilization and liberty and became ardent patriots and ardent advocates of democracy, whereas now we're having, immigration in large numbers of people, and we've seen it in Europe even more plainly than in the mass immigration to this country, where they are importing. It's not that they are embracing, Western democracy. They're importing, foreign tyranny, foreign prejudice, religious prejudice, even their anti-Semitism along with them, and seeking to impose it on the West. And that's the problem, and that's why it's really not viable.
Well, that is a big part of the problem. They are coming into a country.
And they're not, and because of DEI and other things, they're not really being essentially forced to assimilate, learn English, practice democracy in a way that perhaps they were a century ago.
Well, that's absolutely right. They're coming into a society which is dominated by an anti-Western, anti-American elite, that is convinced that we are racist, that we are evil, that Western society and Western culture is not worth defending, that embraces this bizarre multiculturalism, this cult of diversity. So they're coming into a completely different atmosphere. But I think it's not just that. I really do believe, and people don't want to admit it, all right, that bringing in people from Judeo-Christian backgrounds, and I think, Christianity and the religious understandings loom very large here because they do affect the culture. And even though many of these places were not strictly democratic, they had been moving for quite a while towards more liberal and democratic ideas and methods of organization. So the immigrants that we had at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, I think really were a different sort. The third factor of it is that they came into a booming economy, right, that needed people to do basic jobs, but also offered the opportunity to expand into a middle class. And now we really don't have that situation as much. Right, in that the second and third generation of people from the global South, or even, from India, they are not necessarily all going to be able to move up in the world just because of the way that our society has become more crowded, more stagnant. It's a different situation. So I actually think that, given all the differences, we can't look to that period as a model. We need a new model. And a lot of the people, American citizens in the heartland, they're kind of being squeezed out and pushed out. They're sort of losing out. And I mean, that's partly why Trump was elected, is that a lot of people feel that they're being replaced. Of course, they are being replaced.
And when they're being counted, Democrats, a lot of people on the left talk about with anticipation that they're being replaced, that we, and because they think, and I think probably, perhaps wrongly thinking that, if the more immigration from non-Western countries, the better their results will be. That's, I think in 2024, we saw that wasn't necessarily the case.
Right.
But I think you're right. The what's happened functionally in this country now is that, especially with illegal immigration and, sort of the support from basically Wall Street, from, and the credentialed elites, is that they want a mass number of people to come in and to depress working class wages, to keep, wages low, and to perform as sort of, a class of, a large number of group of people who are basically serfs performing tasks for the credentialed elites, cutting their lawn, watching their children, cleaning their houses at cut rate wages, and basically edging out the working class, depressing their wages, making housing more expensive, burdening communities. And that is a large measure of why Trump did win last year.
Right. And I mean, it's a complex situation because the working class is not entirely blameless. But, it's hard to know. It's chicken and egg problem, right? Why is the working class so depressed, so lacking in willingness, in work ethic? Why are their families falling apart? I mean, all of this stuff is happening. but it's not going to heal if we bring in all of this cheap labor, all of these coolies, right? So, the elites are perfectly happy with that, and they have all of this fairy tale happy rhetoric to paper it over. And they also hate the deplorables because the deplorable working class doesn't, adopt their cultural attitudes, their worldview. They consider them some kind of threat. They condescend to them. They hate Trump voters. I mean, let's be clear. They have contempt for them, even though once again they say otherwise. And what we're really seeing is a short-term thinking. They don't think about the next generation, their children, their grandchildren, because they're having fewer and fewer of them, of course. And many of these groups, not all, but let's just take the Mexicans and people from the global South, they, after several generations, they sort of sink into the underclass. They're going to be a burden on society. And nobody wants to think about that. Nobody wants to face up to it. Hispanics are the least educated subgroup of people in the country. They just seem to flatline. Well, they are from a peasant society, and peasant societies are radically different. For at least non-Western peasant societies are radically different than even Western working class peasant societies in their trajectory and their way of thinking. And nobody wants to talk about this stuff in a serious way. It's really kind of verboten to talk about this stuff in a serious way. And it has to all take place outside the academy, of course.
Yeah, well, I think the debate about the future of the Hispanic community is one that is serious. I think we've seen signs among those who have legal status, and these are very hardworking and sort of adopted what we considered Western standards. And a lot of them voted for Trump last year because they want to protect their idea about the American dream. They don't want to sink into the lower class as the permanent underclass, which we've seen, unfortunately, with other minority communities in this country.
But here's the question. Can they run our modern, advanced, complicated technological society? Can they do it? All right. Well, here's the problem. They haven't been able to do it in their native countries. I mean, if you look at the countries where these people are coming from, I'm going to use Trump's word, they're holes. All right. Why is that? Why do we think when they come here, they're going to change their stripes and change their ways? I mean, maybe they will, but it's a gamble. It's a huge gamble. I don't see any reason to think that, we're not going to turn into Mexico as opposed to Mexicans turning into us in all respects. It could go either way, for heaven's sakes.
Well, there is a tendency among many commentators, and especially in the Jewish community, to treat immigration as a sacrosanct right, whether you've done it legally or not, and to claim it is hypocritical, if not impermissible, for anyone who is a descendant of immigrants, a category into which the vast majority of Americans fall, to say that some countries or some groups ought not to be admitted and others not, others can be. How do we have a national conversation in this country about an issue that is of grave importance without it just always being a matter of name calling, or as we've seen, now in Los Angeles, without it being a cause for riots and a belief that it is tyrannical for the government to attempt to restore order?
Well, I don't have a ready answer to that question. First of all, this is not an all or none conversation. All right. I am advocating much lower numbers and priority given to countries and people who have a track record and who've proven their affinity with our culture. All right. So I would vastly reduce the number of people coming from South America, from Mexico and the like. Of course, we have this horrendous problem of illegals, which, is kind of a separate issue. But for Jews to countenance illegal immigration, which is, directly contrary to the rule of law, and these are democratically enacted rules and laws. I mean, if you don't like them and you think they're unjust, change them. don't defy them. So to me, it is outrageous that we have people in the Jewish community who should be standing up for the rule of law, democratically enacted laws, turning a blind eye to illegal immigration. That's crazy. On the legal immigration front, it's very difficult to have this conversation because it is led by this kind of feminized, feel-good, knee-jerk, very primitive set of reactions that is just, compassion drenched with no other concerns and considerations allowed to be brought in. And it's a complete non sequitur. And I've gotten lots of people saying this to me, to say, well, because you're an immigrant, you have to be an open borders person who makes no distinctions and allows everybody in. Well, that just doesn't follow. That's completely illogical. Okay. We came at a very different time under very different circumstances when the law was different, the economy was different, the national ethos was different, the elite's demand for assimilation was different. I mean, we can just go on and on and on about the contrasts and the disparities between the two situations, but none of that gets to come into play. And once again, I'm astonished that Jewish people are leading the charge here because they're supposed to be sophisticated, nuanced thinkers who understand how all of these factors do come into the picture, are important, and can't be disregarded just because of feeling and being nice and all of this. I am going to use the word feminized. I think that a lot of people who are leading the charge on this silliness are women. They're supposed to be educated. In fact, they don't know anything. I'm amazed at their ignorance, frankly. I'm not talking about every person, but by and large, it's very, very disappointing to me.
Yeah, well, the Jewish community is sort of stuck in the past, and the idea that, sort of everybody who wants to come to this country on a bogus asylum claim or, is somehow analogous to Jews fleeing Nazi Europe, for their certain death in Nazi Europe for their, fleeing for their lives, that's analogous to our current situation. I mean, that's basically insane. But it is how the argument goes, and it is, it is sort of the culture to think that way, to treat, every illegal alien, as if he's Anne Frank, they're Anne Frank hiding in, behind the bookcase. Yet that is the rhetoric that we hear. That is why, white liberals or progressives go into the streets to protest against the enforcement of the law. Of course, yes, you're right. They're hypocrites. When it comes to January 6th, they're all for, the rule of law, and anybody who does anything to a policeman is a criminal. Whereas, with riots in the streets, whether it was in the Black Lives Matter summer or today in Los Angeles, that's perfectly okay.
Right. And the reductio of their attitudes is absurd. I mean, how can we really rescue the whole world when most of the world is, a persecutorial mess, government-wise, because that is really what it entails. And then the other thing that never gets talked about, and I do talk about in an article that I wrote called The Case for Low and Slow, is what about the other countries? Who's going to improve them? There are millions, billions of people living outside the United States. And if we take the best and the brightest in and pat ourselves on the back and congratulate ourselves that we've provided a haven for these people, and many of the people coming are elites. I mean, certainly that's true from India. It's true from Asia. Okay. It's true from parts of Africa. The Nigerians that are coming are the super, super elite. All right. We're draining the elites from these countries. Why do we think these countries will ever get better? Why don't these people feel an obligation to stay and improve their own situation? A lot of their people, well, of course, they don't feel the obligation. That's the cultural difference. They have almost no sense of civic obligation towards their fellow countrymen. I mean, take Brahmin Indians. People get on me for dumping on them, but excuse me, I have not seen very much evidence of the Indian elite and upper middle class feeling any sense of obligation to their fellow Indians at all. Well, that's a little bit ominous. Do you really
Well,
want
caste is a real thing in India.
Yeah, do you
obviously.
really want a lot of people who have those attitudes coming into your own country? And they fault us for our racism, for our toxic white supremacy and all of this stuff. I mean, it's really makes no sense at all. So, you're not allowed to talk about these things. So the rest of the world languishes. It's a mess. And there's no improvement on the horizon if all the best people are leaving.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about those Los Angeles riots is, of course, we see these Mexican flags everywhere, or flags of other foreign countries, which, frankly, even the New York Times acknowledged that these are Republican Party campaign ads in the making. But it's also, we've seen the merging of a lot of these, far left causes, whether it's extremist environmentalism, anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, the pro-Hamas mobs. It's not just Greta Thunberg. We've seen Palestinian flags in Los Angeles as well. Is this kind of all coming together as sort of this does it bring home to the fact that this is sort of a leftist war on Western civilization, in a broad sense, in addition to all the specifics that we argue about, and basically about that?
Oh, I think it absolutely is a lefty war on Western civilization. I absolutely think so. I mean, the degree, the pitch of rhetoric, the kind of mindless antagonism to everything that we represent, and of course, that we have conferred upon the world, including on them. Mm-hmm. The irony is, of course, that these people are desperate to get in here, and yet those who are advocating to let them in never stop telling us what an awful place it is, how exploitative it is, how toxic, how supremacist it is, racist it is, every bad thing you can imagine, and how it has to be demolished and rebuilt in the image of the third world that these people come from. None of it makes any sense. It's completely incoherent, and I am not equipped to analyze where all these terrible ideas come from. They've been very long in the making. And now, gradually and suddenly, they've just taken over the elites. And the elites they really have not done their job to defend all of the basic constitutional principles and ideas without, saying that we're perfect, because part of what makes us great is that we are capable of self-criticism. We are capable of examining our own practices and trying to alter them and improve them. But this radical revolutionary mindset, it really is, I think, very ominous, very destructive. I really am fearful when I see what's going on in the streets of Los Angeles. And then I see people who should know better apologizing for it. That's the shocking part. Not that, people are selfish and they resort to violence and looting and all vandalism and all the other stuff that they resort to, because that's always a danger. That's always, below the surface. It's roiling below the surface. But that the people in charge don't say, I'm sorry, but this will not pass. You cannot do this. Decent people do not tolerate this. But it's been a long time that this kind of stuff has been, forgiven.
Mm-hmm.
I think law and order are wonderful words. I am not ashamed of them. Somehow they've become a badge of shame, of right-wing craziness.
Yeah, for some.
It's nuts.
In conclusion, as we come to the end of the program, you've been through so much personally, and been in the middle of this battle. Are you optimistic about this fight to change academia and to do something about the impact of misguided immigration policies? Or, is it easy to succumb to despair about the system being too far gone to be saved?
I'm not succumbing to despair. I think we are kind of on a knife edge here because, we have a battle royal between the Republicans and the Democrats, the right and the left right now. In Canada, I was talking about the whole concept of a loyal opposition that prevailed in our country for a very long time. And that's a very fragile concept, which is we're all in this together. We're all citizens. We all want our country to flourish. We want the best. We just have different ideas about how to accomplish that. And of course, Lincoln spoke of it in the second inaugural after a long, hard fight, Civil War. He said, no, we are not enemies. We are friends. We must be friends. We are fellow citizens. So I think to cling to that idea of being fellow citizens, to tolerate, however grudgingly, the people who disagree with you, that ethos is being lost. And frankly, I blame the left much more than the right because they have a lot more cultural power. Okay. So we need to bring back that ethos. And I also think, that the Republicans, the conservatives, need to be a lot smarter about how to retain power, because I think that's where, frankly, being a Republican and conservative myself, where the hope for preservation lies. Trump, he's definitely a phenom. He's managed to get himself elected. He's kind of bumbling through, but unless we develop a strong, cohesive leadership on the right to retain power and use it wisely and effectively, then things are not going to go well. Because the left is a menace in our society right now. The left is truly, truly, I think, this is my opinion, but I know a lot of people who agree with me, is really, I think at this point, a dangerous force. More dangerous than, the right with some of the stuff they're doing. And I would like to see them tamed.
Yes. Well, I agree with you on that. I think Trump 2.0 has to be better than Trump 1.0. There's been some signs of more seriousness, but we'll see how they carry through with it. And for all of you out there who like to correct us when we say things or misquote or something, I think that was the first inaugural of Abraham Lincoln. So you don't have to put it in the comments.
I'm not an expert
on
on Lincoln, so
so spare us the criticisms. But anyway, Professor Wax, thanks so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any one of the various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. One programming note, we'll be off next week, but we'll be back in the first week of July with a new episode. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon. And thanks again to our sponsors, the Jewish Future Promise. Sign the promise at jewishfuturepromise.org/sign the promise.